Good morning, everyone. My name is Jamie Kwong. I'm a fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I will be chairing what I think is quite a timely panel on non-proliferation. So just to set the scene a little bit, we're at a moment when there are certainly a number of challenges facing the non-proliferation regime. Iran is probably top of mind for many folks in the room, given the events of this summer, the actively developing diplomacy at the moment. And I think we can say there's an increased risk that we may see a 10th nuclear armed state, and we can think about the possible follow-on effects from that. North Korea's expanding and increasingly sophisticated arsenal is fueling a very real debate in South Korea about the potential for developing an independent nuclear program. In Asia and Europe, concerns about U.S. Commitment to extended deterrence is potentially undermining the substantial value of extended deterrence as a non-proliferation tool. And of course, there's the crisis of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as we approach a big RevCon year, with concerns about a potential for a quiet quitting and what that might mean for hollowing out this cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime. And I think we can also point to growing nuclear competitions that see some states already expanding their nuclear arsenals, and we may see even more vertical proliferation going forward. So clearly, it's a big topic, and I'm delighted to have four excellent panelists to help us unpack these issues. I'll go ahead and start by introducing all of them, and then we'll dive right in. So first we have Mhairi McClafferty, a policy fellow at BASIC, and she has expertise in nuclear diplomacy and conflict resolution, the latter of which in particular I think will be quite relevant in your presentation on nuclear sharing and the NPT. We'll then hear from Sophie Somerville Roberts, an IR and politics student at the University College London, and she'll be marrying her interests in strategic policy and the influence of social media to help us better understand how cultural narratives might threaten public support for non-proliferation. And finally, we'll hear from Theo Brown and Adam Harris, a software developer and software model engineer at MASS, which is a technology company really geared towards national security and defense customers. And they'll be drawing on both of their interests in expanding their technical expertise to the political realm, and will be presenting on the very timely European deterrence discussion with a focus specifically on Poland. So let me stop talking and go ahead and turn it over to Mhairi. Thank you.
Yeah, so hello everyone, and thank you for having me here today. And as Jamie mentioned, I'm going to be talking about nuclear sharing and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. So nuclear sharing isn't new. It has been around for decades, but today it has become a growing focus of international debate. At the heart of this lies a battle of narratives, where some argue that nuclear sharing is necessary for deterrence and stability, while others see it as fundamentally undermining the treaty and its disarmament commitments. These competing narratives are deeply polarising, and nuclear sharing has become one of the sharpest fault lines at NPT meetings, often blocking consensus and raising doubts about the treaty's future relevance. So that's why today I want to argue that space for an open dialogue on nuclear sharing is urgently needed to reduce polarisation within the NPT. So how I'm going to structure this presentation is I'll start with a quick overview of the NPT, and then I'll explain what nuclear sharing is, using NATO as the classic example, and then turn to how these arrangements are spreading globally. From there, I'll turn to the battle of narratives that surround nuclear sharing, focus on 4 key points where disagreements emerge, and show how these competing narratives deepen polarisation within the NPT. Finally, I will close with some recommendations on how to reduce this polarisation and create a space outside of the NPT for a more open dialogue on nuclear sharing. So as I'm sure everybody knows, the NPT is often described as the cornerstone of the global nuclear order. It entered into force in 1970 and has a total of 191 member states, making it the most widely accepted arms control agreement. The treaty rests on 3 pillars: preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, promoting the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and advancing disarmament. Article 1 of the treaty prohibits nuclear states from transferring nuclear weapons to any recipient, while Article 2 prohibits non-nuclear weapon states from receiving or exercising control over such weapons. So these provisions forbid the transfer and acquisition, but they do not explicitly address practices such as nuclear sharing, where a nuclear state retains custody and control. This has opened an avenue for debate about what is allowed under the treaty, creating room for interpretation around nuclear sharing. So, nuclear sharing generally refers to arrangements where a nuclear armed state deploys nuclear weapons to allied countries that do not possess them. While the nuclear power retains ownership and control, the host country is directly involved in the planning, training, and in extreme circumstances, the potential use of these weapons. The best known example, as I mentioned, is NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, and more recently we've also seen Russia deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus. So, beginning in the 1950s, the US forward deploys nuclear weapons to territory of NATO members in Europe that do not possess their own nuclear arsenals. A number of allies contribute dual-capable aircraft which would be used to deliver these weapons in a conflict. Under these arrangements, the US maintains sole custody and control of the nuclear weapons, while allies provide military support through DCA missions with conventional forces and capabilities. Today it is estimated that the US has 100 nuclear weapons stationed in 5 European countries, that being Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands and Turkey. Any nuclear mission, however, requires explicit political consultation and approval by NATO's Nuclear Planning Group, as well as authorisation by the US President. So what are NATO's arguments for this practice? And there's 4 main points that I want to highlight. First is extended deterrence. So NATO considers nuclear sharing central to its defence posture, and by involving multiple allies in nuclear arrangements, it signals a collective commitment to the use of nuclear weapons if necessary, demonstrating unity and cohesion amongst allies. Second is alliance cohesion. Nuclear sharing allows non-nuclear allies to participate in the development and implementation of NATO's nuclear deterrence policy. Through the NPG, allies share accountability for both political and operational aspects of NATO's nuclear posture, fostering solidarity and reinforcing collective security. Third, preventing internal proliferation. So by extending the US nuclear umbrella, NATO argues that nuclear sharing removes incentives for allies to develop their own nuclear arsenals. And finally, compliance with the NPT. NATO maintains that because the US retains custody and control of nuclear weapons during peacetime, the treaty is therefore not violated. These arrangements, NATO also notes, that predate the treaty and as such were permitted during its negotiations. But nuclear sharing is no longer a practice only confined to NATO, and we are seeing its influence spread globally in different ways. As I mentioned, Russia has deployed nuclear weapons in Belarus, citing NATO's precedent as justification. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine and doubts about the reliability of US extended deterrence have reignited debates in Europe over whether Europe should pursue an independent nuclear deterrent or expand NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. Adding to this, there are also rumours that the US is possibly upgrading RAF Lakenheath for the possible redeployment of US nuclear weapons to the UK. And finally, in East Asia, growing concerns over North Korea and China, as well as doubts about US extended deterrence, have triggered debates in Japan and South Korea about whether to adopt a NATO-style nuclear sharing arrangement or the development of their own nuclear deterrent. But how exactly is nuclear sharing shaping debates within the NPT? And at the heart of this lies a battle of competing narratives. These narratives fuel deepening polarisation within the treaty regime, hardening positions and making consensus building ever more difficult. Nuclear sharing has become one of the sharpest fault lines, widening the gap between states that regard nuclear sharing as a legitimate form of deterrence and those that consider it a violation of the treaty spirit and obligation. And I think this polarisation plays out through 4 interconnected narratives. And the first is tensions with Article 1 and Article 2. So supporters, particularly NATO, argue that nuclear sharing complies with Articles 1 and 2 because the US maintains sole custody and control of these weapons and that the arrangements were known and understood during the NPT's negotiations. Critics, however, including China and many non-aligned states, counter that the training of non-nuclear weapon states in delivery and deployment of nuclear weapons constitutes a de facto transfer, undermining the treaty's non-proliferation objectives. The non-aligned movement in particular has repeatedly called such arrangements a violation of Articles 1 and Articles 2, urging that all states end nuclear sharing in peacetime or wartime. China as well has gone further, calling on nuclear weapon states to abolish nuclear sharing and extend deterrence, withdraw all deployed weapons from abroad, and clarify whether current arrangements violate Articles 1 and Article 2 obligations. The second battle is the undermining of disarmament obligations. So Article 6 of the NPT requires all states parties to pursue negotiations in good faith towards nuclear disarmament. Non-nuclear weapon states, particularly in the Global South and NAM, argue that nuclear sharing increases the salience of nuclear weapons and demonstrates that nuclear weapon states are not serious about reducing reliance on these weapons. NAM has repeatedly stressed that the persistent reliance on nuclear weapons through policies such as extended deterrence and nuclear sharing run counter to the spirit and objectives of the treaty and therefore threatens its credibility and effectiveness. At the 2025 PrepCom, NAM went further, warning that evolving nuclear sharing arrangements and doctrines involving nuclear sharing and doctrines of extended deterrence represent a new nuclear arms race and therefore constitute a clear violation of Article 6. 3 is the issue of double standards. So NATO defends its nuclear sharing arrangements as treaty compliant while condemning Russia's deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus. Russia exploits this narrative, presenting NATO as hypocritical, yet despite Russia's own deployments in Belarus, its argument does resonate with many states who perceive a broader Western double standard, where NATO and its members advocate for deterrence and nuclear sharing for themselves, whilst urging other states to refrain from similar practices, and this perception of hypocrisy has hardened divisions within the NPT. And finally, proliferation risks. So critics argue that the normalising of practices such as nuclear sharing may encourage other countries or regimes to seek similar arrangements, undermining the treaty's non-proliferation norms. Russia has already deployed nuclear weapons in Belarus, citing NATO's precedent as justification, and moreover, China warns that nuclear sharing is showing signs of spreading to the Asia-Pacific region, with potential US deployments there risking the simulation of a regional arms race. And as I mentioned earlier as well, in Europe, renewed debates about developing an independent deterrent or expanded NATO nuclear sharing arrangements demonstrates how these arrangements can escalate reliance on nuclear weapons. So this battle of narratives around nuclear sharing has become one of the sharpest sources of division within the treaty. For some, nuclear sharing is a legitimate form of deterrence, while for others it is a violation that undermines the treaty's credibility. This clash of perspectives has repeatedly blocked consensus at review conferences, eroding trust among member states and fueling disillusionment with the treaty's ability to govern the nuclear order. So unless these narratives around nuclear sharing are addressed, the NPT risks entering the 2026 review conference more fractured than ever. So what can be done to strengthen the NPT considering this battle of narratives on nuclear sharing? And I want to make two recommendations. So the first is reaffirming and clarifying the scope of the NPT. States should use the 2026 review conference to reaffirm the treaty as a primary framework for governing nuclear weapons. All parties should collectively reiterate the obligations under the NPT, including Articles 1, 2 and 6. However, I think states should avoid debating the rights and wrongs or legality of nuclear sharing within the NPT itself, since these discussions are deeply polarising. Instead, states should focus on areas where consensus can be achieved, such as transparency, reporting and confidence-building measures. And since these debates around nuclear sharing are too polarising for the NPT to resolve within the NPT, I'm suggesting a separate inclusive forum for dialogue on nuclear sharing should be created ahead of the 2026 review conference. This dialogue would allow states to discuss nuclear sharing practices more openly and could also examine its legal, security and proliferation implications, extending the discussion beyond NATO's practices to include emerging debates in Europe and the Asia-Pacific, as well as the deterrence activities of Russia and China. So the goal of this dialogue is to reduce misunderstandings and counter misleading narratives around nuclear sharing, so that when states return to the NPT framework, consensus on less contentious issues can be strengthened. So overall, these recommendations aim to address challenges posed by nuclear sharing without trying to determine whether it's right or wrong under the NPT. By moving this contentious discussion outside of the treaty and fostering a dedicated dialogue on nuclear sharing, states can reduce polarisation and strengthen trust across the treaty, strengthen trust across the treaty's membership. So recommendations, as I've said, they do not intend to eliminate nuclear sharing, but instead aim to manage its impact on the NPT by protecting the treaty's credibility and ensuring that consensus can be built on areas where agreement is possible ahead of the 2026 review conference. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions or comments in the Q&A.
Okay, I'd like to thank Rusi and the PONI team for allowing me to present here today on the media and the bomb. In light of rising geopolitical instability and uncertainty over the reliability of the US nuclear umbrella, non-proliferation efforts are being called ever more into question, and serious questions are being raised about the future of non-proliferation. However, I think that there is a risk to non-proliferation that is being overlooked, and that is the change in our cultural narratives around nuclear weapons and non-proliferation efforts, especially among younger generations such as my own Gen Z. Put simply, we are losing control of the narrative, and in fixing the script, we can fix the pipeline and ensure a continuous flow of support for non-proliferation into the time horizon. Now, there we go. To understand the change in our cultural narrative and the effects it has on opinions and motivations of my generation, we first need to understand who are we talking about when we refer to Gen Z, what changes have occurred in our culture, why it is a risk to non-proliferation efforts, and what we can do about it. So, to start off, who are Gen Z? Gen Z were born between 1997 and 2012, which makes the oldest of my generation not even 30 years old. Our age, or our lack thereof it, affects us in two main ways: our memory and our mediation. Firstly, we are now 80 years on from the close of the Second World War. Most households with Gen Z members have lost the kitchen table tutor, the grandparent or the great-grandparent, who could explain the cost and consequence of war. Moreover, with military service now being voluntary, ever fewer young people are growing up with households where they can have familial stories detailing what conflict entails. On the aspect of nuclear use, be it testing or otherwise, we have no memory. Think of the North Korean nuclear tests. The reports of those tests arrived in our childhood without any sort of gripping visual. Give me a moment. We also know that the Cold War was named for staying cold. So actually in our memory, we have never seen nuclear use, and we have always seen wars being fought by nuclear armed powers conventionally. For my generation, this history means that we are starting to see the nuclear alarm as a case of the boy who cried wolf at a strategic scale. As for mediation, Gen Z are digital nomads. This means that our news feeds come through decentralized and personalized feeds, with content being high volume and low impact. Content is engaging enough to promote a reaction, but light enough to keep a user engaged and scrolling on. This means we absorb spectacle over process, and we understand sharp moral frames over the slow worked of process. This trend towards short-form content means contradictory motives, trade-offs, and processes are selected out of our media. Onto this base, we then add the mutated cultural narrative around nuclear weapons and non-proliferation efforts. Our cultural narrative towards nuclear issues has shifted, as I see it, in four main ways. To start with, nuclear weapons are becoming mythologized, with an idealized, easy-to-digest image. Decades ago, Britain's Threads and ABC's The Day After worked to scare whole nations into seeing nuclear weapons as terrifying. Now, titles such as Armageddon, The Avengers, and recently Dune 2 all depict nuclear weapons as being key to saving the day. Even with titles such as Oppenheimer, which showcase nuclear destructive power, these shows are not to be taken as the rule of nuclear media. We additionally cannot expect any cautionary media to have the effect we think it will. People find it hard to focus on possible negatives. You can see this in the comments section for an upcoming film called House of Dynamite. It regards a possible nuclear strike on the US, but if you look in the comments section, there's no mention of nuclear strikes on the US or the growing nuclear risk or what it might mean for normal people. It's full of people fangirling over Rebecca Ferguson. Secondly, to being mythologized, nuclear weapons are being gamified. The cultural juggernaut that is Call of Duty has multiple titles making use of nuclear weapons, as do other game series such as the Fallout game series, which was recently adapted for Amazon Prime. These two titles alone have hundreds of millions of players with billions of aggregated play hours. If I'm to use a Fat Man in Fallout 4 to tactically nuke my enemies and make my playthrough infinitely easier, then for me and so many other players, nuclear weapons are becoming a means with which we achieve our end. Beyond the gamification of nuclear weapons, In games, be them indie or AAA titles with hundreds or hundreds of millions of players, this also represents, in part, the third change to our nuclear media, which is normalisation. Across film, TV, and our books, and games, and even our memes, nuclear content is, if not common, then it is no longer rare. From educational to entertainment media, the quantity of nuclear content, most notably nuclear content that is video-based, has risen. With the rise in short-form video content too, it is no longer the case that one piece of media will stay as one piece of media. A film can be cut and edited into thousands of short-form videos and released for free. With algorithmic push feeds, this media can reach more people, and no longer does media consumption need a TV or a paid ticket. It simply needs internet access. Familiarity isn't an endorsement, but it resets the baseline. Nuclear weapons stop being othered and start reading as ambient. It is this ambience which has likely fueled the mutation of our language too. Our everyday language has absorbed nuclear vernacular, with terms such as nuke becoming casual language. Just think of the expression, I'm going to nuke this in the microwave. For older generations, these words carried an existential weight, while for my generation, they are common metaphors. We live in a world where the same phrase now ships different cargo. So when a politician warns of breaking the nuclear taboo, some hear Armageddon, while others hear a dramatic headline. This semantic drift dulls risk perception, scrambles intent, and makes cross-generational debates misfire. Again. Now, my generation isn't foolish. If asked, we will tell you nuclear weapons are bad, because we know we are bad, because that has been taught to us as a fact. But a fact I can repeat to you is not the same as a belief I hold or an emotion that motivates me. Across TV, games, memes, and even our own lived history, the nuclear cultural narrative is emerging as a fictionalized trope, a gameplay mechanic, a never-gonna-happen risk, and it can be found everywhere. The othering of nuclear weapons into their own mystic category did something to help contain them and support non-proliferation with terror, cost, and distance. Those supports to non-proliferation are fading. To maintain the commitment of younger generations towards non-proliferation, not just when asked, but when the issue comes to bear and we have to act on our spoken support, we need to again anchor feeling into the non-proliferation campaign. If the goal is durable youth commitment to non-proliferation, you need to start where feeling already lives. Co-opt, or better yet, partner with the movements that already motivate Gen Z. Work inside the groups Gen Z runs. Climate activism has shown it can mobilize and sustain momentum for years. These movements build habits of showing up, organizing, and measuring impact. We can make the link between not just the climate movement and non-proliferation, but any movement built on the principles of equality, equity, and justice. We can highlight and use the same languages that these movements understand: systemic threat, cascading failure, and irreversibility. The aim isn't to bolt non-proliferation onto an existing movement, but to show that assisting non-proliferation is part of the same moral and practical projects younger generations care about. If we co-design format, speak in their cadence, and are transparent about aims, motives, and funding, then we can leverage existing energy without killing it. Another possible solution is to treat young creators as translators, not as spokespeople or mouthpieces. If we use youth voices, as is happening in the Youth for Disarmament programme, it is a step in the right direction. But the moment a voice feels stage-managed, it loses oxygen. The fix is to give creators access to real expertise. Small, off-the-record teach-ins where they can ask and answer questions without posturing, and briefings that do not oversimplify and risk talking down to Gen Z. Once that is done, get out of their way. Editorial independence is sacrosanct, as while the arguments for non-proliferation might not have changed over the years, the audience has. Delivery, tone, and formality has to match how Gen Z consume and share information, which is conversational, iterative, visually led, and grounded in a voice they trust. Authenticity above all else. Finally, beyond the social movements, we can make use of Gen Z's culture to emotionally ground arguments and make the stakes of the game felt. As odd as it may sound, we can use online communities, such as BookTok, to our advantage. BookTok may be known for its very questionable romance recommendations, but that is what we want. We want to thread the tropes people love into stories on non-proliferation and hook emotion into education. If we can find and identify the communities where Gen Z congregate in, then we can reframe our explanations to include what it is they love. We can fund films, series, novels, serial fictions, graphic novels, and video games, which can render both the risk of loss and the slow procedural work of prevention in long-form content. After doing this, we can then allow the feeds to do their work, cut and edit that content down, multiply it massively, and then increase reach and mass. Taken together, there isn't a single strategy with which we can secure the future of non-proliferation. What we can do is meet Gen Z inside the communities that already animate them, empower creators to translate rather than repeat talking points, and build cultural works that shift nuclear policy from a distant concept to a felt reality. If we work to and with the audience for non-proliferation efforts, then we can secure the floor of support needed for the future of non-proliferation as it faces ever more challenges and louding dissenting voices. Thank you for listening.
Good morning. My name is Theo. I'm a software developer at Caution working for MASS.
And my name's Adam. I'm a model engineer also working for MASS in Caution. Starting off with some background.
Poland, the world's next nuclear power. Well, Poland's current Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, certainly thinks so. Poland must reach for the most modern possibilities also related to nuclear weapons. He was quoted by the Financial Times as saying, showing there is a clear political will for Poland to advance its nuclear status. Poland's president at the time, Andrzej Duda, also was quoted by the BBC as saying, Poland is ready to host NATO nuclear weapons.
Why would Poland want nuclear weapons? Well, leading up to World War I, Poland ceased to exist as a country for 123 years, and throughout World War II it was also occupied. This has led them to be at the forefront of European rearmament and defence spending, and they are now the highest defence spender in NATO as a proportion of their GDP, at 4.2%. We've looked at 3 different ways that Poland could increase their nuclear defence beyond the current Article 5 agreement they have under NATO, which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Starting off with their paths. The first path we've looked at is a sovereign nuclear weapon programme alongside 9 other nations. It's been the United States, Russia, China, France, the UK, Pakistan, India, North Korea, and Israel. We have seen what's happened recently with other nations that have attempted to acquire nuclear weapons, specifically with Iran. The US bombed Iran and led an international coalition of sanctions against the country. We also saw what happened before that with North Korea, only they were successful. This did, however, lead to crippling economic sanctions and widespread poverty throughout the country, and they now have the lowest international trade of any country.
The main difference here, however, is that both Iran and North Korea were already pariah states, isolated from the international community. Poland, however, is a key economic hub in Europe with open borders to multiple EU countries. Imposing similar restrictions to a NATO and EU member would be far more complex and damaging to other Western nations than when they did the same to Iran and North Korea. This could, however, work against Poland too, due to their strong integration with Europe. Hiding their nuclear weapons would be near impossible. If other countries knew about the programme, Poland would likely face larger repercussions than if they were able to keep it more secretive.
The second path we have looked at is joining the NATO nuclear sharing programme, which Mhairi spoke about earlier. This is where the US currently shares weapons with 5 other states: Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. The exact nature of this agreement is obviously unknown, but Poland do have the F-35 fighter jet, which is capable of carrying nuclear weapons, so the idea is not entirely infeasible. However, J.D. Vance was quoted as saying that he would be shocked if Donald Trump did move nuclear weapons into Poland. So it does seem that there is lack of will with the current administration to do this. However, the administration has been known to change their mind rapidly due to changing climates.
In the past, Russia had been ardently against the NATO nuclear sharing programme, going as far as to claim it violates the all-important Non-Proliferation Treaty. Whilst this is generally not believed to be the case, it is a claim that Russia no longer can make. This is because Russia and Belarus entered into a similar agreement in 2023 following the invasion of Ukraine a year prior. That does not mean that joining the NATO nuclear sharing programme wouldn't be without risk for Poland, though. Any land-based nuclear weapon, as is believed to be used by the NATO nuclear sharing nations, is a potential target for a preemptive strike. Given Poland's closer proximity to Russia than most other NATO countries, Poland would likely be an easy target, an early target, should nuclear war ever break out with Russia if they did acquire US-made weapons.
The third path we have looked at is a European nuclear umbrella, likely coming from France, but a joint agreement between France and the UK has also been suggested. This should be whereby the countries, either France or the UK or both, assign their nuclear weapons in defence explicitly of Poland outside of the NATO agreement. France are currently not part of the NATO nuclear planning group, so their nuclear weapons are solely for their own use. But Emmanuel Macron has declared that he is launching a strategic debate to protect Europe further.
Such a move would be a massive change in French nuclear policy, as it would be the first time it was assigned to another nation's defence. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has urged both the UK and France to discuss creating a second European nuclear umbrella as a complement to the US nuclear umbrella currently provided under NATO. This could give Poland what they are asking for in terms of a nuclear weapons-backed defence guarantee. It also could be seen as the more plausible option given the US's apparent opposition to widening NATO nuclear sharing to Poland. On the other hand, the UK and France have been far more willing to discuss expanding the nuclear umbrella they provide. Overall, we believe the most likely outcome is that Poland will maintain its current nuclear umbrella and under NATO and will not try and create its own nuclear programme. We also do not believe that joining NATO's nuclear sharing programme is a realistic outcome due to JD Vance's comments mentioned earlier. Such a NATO nuclear sharing programme could also be highly escalatory towards Russia, and the Trump administration has been working on reducing tensions with Russia, specifically around ending the Ukraine war. These closer ties with Russia would clearly be impacted if the US moved nuclear weapons even closer to Moscow.
We do, however, believe that an expanded European nuclear umbrella is possible. Most European nations have banded together since the invasion of Ukraine in order to strengthen the continent's own defences. This has been exacerbated ever since Donald Trump retook the White House in 2024 due to the administration's unpredictable nature and past comments on the NATO alliance. Whether or not this happens is yet to be seen, but Poland's push to increase defence spending up to 4.2% of GDP and beyond is a clear sign that they're investing in defence for their future. Whatever happens, it's clear that Poland will continue to strengthen, with or without a nuclear deterrent beyond NATO's Article 5, which hasn't failed anyone yet. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you all for some really fascinating and I think stimulating presentations. I'm sure we have lots of questions to come from the audience. I might go ahead and take the chair's prerogative and kick us off. And let me just go ahead and go in order and ask.